Assalamualaikum and hi everyone. Today we're going to look at our 7th lecture, Data for Research. Data is a collection of facts and figures to be used for a specific purpose. When arranged in an organized manner, data can be called information. Data is important in research because without it we cannot undertake empirical research. Among the uses of data in research is that we can learn more about the background of our study. Evidence that data provide can also help us to decide on the best solutions for our research questions. With the right data, we can also convince our readers that our suggestions are valid, and data may also be used to help us to describe the situation surrounding our research questions. Specifically, we are interested in the gathering of data that are input to our analysis. In this video lecture, we will look at the different types of data, sources of data, as well as issues related to data collection and usage. Let's talk about the different types of data. As mentioned before, data is information used for research. Data exists in many forms and can be classified in many ways. Data may be quantitative or qualitative, they may be factual or attitudinal, and data may also be time series, cross-sectional, or panel. Let's take a look at these different types of data in more detail. A major type or classification of data is whether they are quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative data are data in which numbers are used to order or represent different levels of an attribute. This includes both numerical data, where the numbers have intrinsic meaning, and ordinal data, where the numbers denote location in an ordered list. In statistics class, we know that quantitative data can further be divided into discrete and continuous data. Quantitative data are usually ready for statistical analysis. Qualitative data, on the other hand, are data in which the attributes cannot be measured by numbers, and hence any numerical value assigned to these attributes cannot be interpreted in this way. They may be categorical, that is, data presented in groups such as gender and marital status, or nominal, that is used for naming or labeling. Qualitative data are usually results from interviews and may need interpretations. Numbers may be used as codes for these attributes, but these numbers have no meaning beyond these codes. They cannot be manipulated mathematically. Sometimes there exists data that cannot be expressed as numbers at all. These may take the form of images, texts, or graphics. All qualitative information can be easily converted into quantitative information. The simplest way to do so is to divide the qualitative information into units and number them. We can then describe the results quantitatively. The number of items in each group can tell us something. Factual data relate to facts, for instance, age of respondent. Not all factual data are quantitative, however, for instance, employment status, but they can be used to classify attributes. Attitudinal data relate to subjective opinions. An example is when a person chooses to agree or disagree. Not all attitudes are qualitative, for instance, the Likert scales. But as you shall see in your research later, quantification of qualitative data requires imposition of certain assumptions on them. In mainly economic research, there are generally 3 types of data: time series, cross-sectional, and panel. Time series data refers to data collected over a period of time. For example, consumption and disposable income for Malaysia from 1980 to 2019. Cross-sectional data refers to data collected from many sources at one point in time. For example, consumption and disposable income of different Asian countries in 2019. Each has its uses. It is possible to combine them too to get a pooled data set. This space-time combination is an example of panel data, which is multidimensional. For instance, consumption and disposable of income of different Asian countries for the period 1980 to 2019. Now let's take a look at the sources of data. For social science research, data are usually obtained in 2 ways. Secondary data is the data that has already been collected by others in the past and made readily available for other researchers to use. The data may also have been collected for general use with no specific research purpose, like in the case of the national census. When data is being reused, it is a primary data for the first research and a secondary data for the second research it is being used for. Primary data, on the other hand, is a type of data that is collected by researchers themselves directly from the main sources. The sources of primary data are usually chosen and tailored specifically to meet the demands or requirements of a particular research. Secondary data have several advantages. Secondary data is more affordable. This is because they require little to no cost for researchers to obtain them. Secondary data is far cheaper to collect than primary data, as they require less resources and the time involved in searching secondary sources is much less than that needed to complete a primary data collection. Secondary databases may also offer richer data set, as there are a wide variety of secondary data sources. Secondary sources of information can also yield more accurate data than that obtained through primary research. This is especially so when a government or international agency has undertaken a large-scale survey or even a census. Most secondary data are easily accessible to researchers. Most of these sources can be accessed online. People who do not have access to the internet can also access them through print, available in libraries or bookstores. The time spent on collecting secondary data is usually very little compared to that of primary data. The only investigation necessary for secondary data collection is the process of sourcing for necessary data sources, therefore cutting the time that would normally be spent on the investigation. This will save a significant amount of time for the researcher. Secondary data is also retrospective. That is, it allows researchers to go back in time and enables them to predict or forecast of future events. However, secondary data also have several drawbacks. Since secondary data were collected by others for their own use, they may not be completely appropriate for another research. There's also no way the researcher can assess the data set's reliability. Besides that, secondary data are collected a while back, so conditions may have changed since the data first collected, so the information may be outdated. Another disadvantage of secondary data is that researchers will spend so much time surfing through a pool of irrelevant data before finally getting the ones they need. This is because the data was not collected mainly for the researcher. In some cases, a researcher may not even find the exact data that he or she needs, but have to settle for the next best alternative. The pros and cons of primary data are the exact opposite. Since secondary data are data collected by someone else, it is important to understand what has been collected. Different researchers use different data to suit the objectives of their own research. These objectives may not be the same as those using secondary data. Therefore, several things need to be considered when using secondary data, among which are the selection of secondary data, definitions used by the secondary data, and compatibility of the resources. When we want to select secondary data, we have to be sure that they are appropriate for our research, representative, as well as reliable. There are many sources of secondary data, so the issue isn't where to obtain them, but to select the most appropriate secondary data, that is, to find data that can help to answer the research questions most directly. For instance, in a study of the poor's access to basic services, the number of households connected to electricity supply is more relevant than the number of school children in poor households who do their homework at night. But multiple data sources is often a luxury. The researcher is often constrained to using what he or she can find. In this situation, the researcher must understand the data's limitations. Given the need to generalize research findings, representativeness or the applicability of data to a majority of the subjects is vital. But how do we know whether a particular data source is representative? One way is to make sure that the data in question does not apply to a time period that is abnormal, such as a recession, or a group that is in the minority, such as war veterans. For example, in a path-breaking longitudinal study of the transition between school and work, researchers at the FEA came to several major conclusions. However, one qualification to these conclusions is that the fieldwork was done between 1989 and 1996, a period in which Malaysia experienced unprecedented prosperity. In addition, there are also methods in sampling to help ensure representativeness. Reliability is also of great importance. After all, garbage in, garbage out. If secondary data is used, the source of data can be a guide. Official data, to the extent they are not considered sensitive, are generally reliable. Those from tabloids or blogs are decidedly less so. Sometimes the same data may be differently defined. For instance, under the communist system, a country's national income is measured by the net material product, which assigns no value to capital. This definition is in accordance with the Marxian labor theory of value, which argues that only labor creates value. Let's take a look at an example for selecting an appropriate secondary data. Here we have the research question, what is poverty? Although we all believe we know what poverty means, it actually has several dimensions. Income poverty or consumption poverty refers to the insufficiency of income to be used to meet consumption needs. Economists define poverty in this way. Poverty is what can be and has been measured so that policies can be devised and implemented to deal with it. Measurement also facilitates comparison across space and time. Material lack or want goes beyond income. It includes a lack of or little wealth and lack or low quality of other assets, such as shelter, clothing, furniture, personal means of transport, radios or television, and so on. This also tends to include no or poor access to services. Proposed by Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen, poverty can also be expressed as capability deprivation, referring to what we can or cannot do, what we can or cannot be. This includes but goes beyond material lack or want to include human capabilities, for example, skills and physical abilities, and also self-respect in society. This encompasses the ability to overcome material lack and, of course, income insufficiency. A fourth cluster takes a yet more broadly multidimensional view of deprivation, with material lack or want as only one of the several mutually reinforcing dimensions. This takes us beyond human capability to achieve self-respect and also includes things like lack of information, political voice, etc., all of which are part of human development. Note that all of these constructs come from development experts, not from the poor themselves. So what do the poor think in terms of poverty? Through interactions with the poor, organizations like the World Bank came up with what can only be defined as ill-being, as opposed to well-being. As the UNDP puts it, there were many poverties or deprivations. Dimensions of the bad life included not only income poverty and material lack, but many others. For example, poverty of time, living and working in bad places. Definitions also matter. Many researchers fail to look at the fine print in which definitions are written. Professor Robert Wade told the story of an OECD study that showed that countries that liberalized grew faster than those that did not. When a group of researchers in Oxford University went back to the source data, it was found that the data were doctored to give extra weights to those countries that were liberalized. Even if the same precise definition is used, there are usually differences in data values that are collected by different parties. Sometimes definitions are hidden away and not easy to find, but reputable agencies always provide precise definitions. An example is the term year. Some sources refer to calendar year, others refer to fiscal year. Economics as a discipline prides itself as being precise. Unfortunately, it has not gotten around to creating a new word to reflect this precision. As a result, the same word has to represent several definitions. Here are several words that have multiple definitions. We have already seen the various definitions of poverty. Let's take a look at these other terms. At the macroeconomic level, income can be defined in gross or net terms, in national and domestic terms, and in national income accounting, income can be measured as income or product, although they should be formally identical. Thus, we have definitions of gross national income, gross domestic product, net national product, etc. At the microeconomic level, it can be defined in household, family, or individual terms, total or disposable terms. Trade can also be variously defined. It can be trade in goods, goods and non-factor services, and trade in all factor and non-factor services. Finally, there are various concepts of exchange rates, nominal, real, or real effective. Here's another example on definitions. Say we are looking at the concept of a country's total output. We know that it can be measured as output or income. Since all output are sold, the different concepts theoretically yield the same result. So what is the big deal? It turns out other dimensions enter into this definition too. Let us stay with output or product. Is it produced domestically, regardless of who produces, or is it produced by the country's citizens, regardless if they are domestic or national? Does it include depreciation, or is it net of it? Is it inclusive of indirect taxes, or not? And finally, an important issue related to secondary data is compatibility of sources. Take, for instance, this example on trading between A and B. There are at least two reasons why data showing exports from country A to country B are different from data showing imports of country B from country A. The first is leakages, or smuggling. Exports that leave country A's shores may be stolen by smugglers at sea and never reach country B. The second relates to how exports and imports are conventionally reported. Exports are always reported as FOB, or free on board, whereas imports are always reported as CIF, or cost of insurance and freight. So shipping costs are always added to imports. This becomes a big problem in the construction of trade matrices. For discussion purposes, consider happiness economics. Several major problems exist when one tries to define happiness. Culture intrudes into this measure because some cultures value individual freedoms more than others. Some value having male offsprings to continue the family line. History also matters because in many countries, including in Asia, the notion of political freedom is not the same as democracy as understood in Western societies. Even if we can identify what the dimensions of happiness are, what weights should we assign to each dimension? These weights are of course dependent on social, cultural, and historical norms. How can happiness be scaled? How different is happiness with scale 10 from happiness with scale 9? Is the difference the same as that between happiness with scale 6 and with scale 5? The scaling itself is subject to cultural preferences. US culture is given to the use of superlatives, while the UK tradition is much more restrained. Chinese culture tend to be reluctant to use negatives, so scales 1 to 3 or 4 out of 10 are seldom recorded. Is there such a thing as national happiness? Clearly, happiness is an individual attribute. The question is, if we add all the happiness together and divide by the number of people, what does gross national happiness per capita mean? Can we compare happiness across countries? Here are major sources of secondary data. You can get data from public documents, official records, and trade associations. You can get them from private documents. You can also get them from mass media, for instance, periodicals, newspapers, books, and the internet. There are also social science data archives, as well as data you can obtain from the Department of Statistics, the Central Bank, as well as world organizations. There are also numerous datasets that you can access online for free, such as Central Bank of Malaysia, Department of Statistics, a free source of US data, Economic Data Online, Yahoo Finance, International Financial Statistics, and World Bank. These days, it is quite common for people to use Wikipedia as a source of reference. But as researchers, is it reliable? Is it appropriate to do so? Here are two sources that you can refer to, so I will leave it to you to decide on your own. A more detailed discussion of primary data collection will be undertaken in a later lecture. But for now, here are several issues related to primary data. 1. What kind of data do the researcher need? Clearly, what are needed is what is most relevant to the research that he or she is undertaking. There are different degrees of relevance, so prioritization is critical. For instance, a researcher working on the importance of branding in education would focus more on determining why students select particular colleges rather than on general education statistics. 2. How does the researcher choose the subjects or elements to be studied? There are obviously a large number of elements than the researcher can handle or even know of. So a sampling is the process of selecting the elements to be studied. Some sampling methods are scientific in that probabilistic methods are used so that the results can be analyzed using statistical inference. 3. How can the required information be collected from them? Again, the researcher has a number of ways of doing so. Each has advantages and drawbacks. Beyond these three questions is a fourth. Once the data are collected, how are they made useful? Data collected are never in a form that can be directly analyzed, so something must be done to process and analyze the data.